You know, when you think about war, what comes to mind? Probably generals, grand strategies, epic battles, right? But what if I told you that behind all of that, there's this invisible force that's actually calling the shots? That force is logistics. It's the nitty-gritty of how you move, supply, and keep an army going. And we're about to see that it's not just some boring support function. No, it's the hidden hand that literally defines the limits of war.
So you've probably heard this famous quote from the Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz. It's the classic take, right? The idea that war is just politics with fighting. For a long time, that's how everyone looked at conflict. A big contest of wills, a way to achieve political goals.
But what if we flip that on its head? Here's the thing. Logistics is the continuation of war by other means. It's not just part of the fight, it sets the actual rules. It's the hard, physical limit on what's even possible. Think about it. Logistics determines how far you can go, how long you can last, how much punch you can pack. It's the physics that governs the politics of war.
So let's take a journey through this hidden history. We're going to break it down into 6 key eras. And you'll see how something as basic as supplying an army has literally shaped the world we live in. All right, so the big idea we're going to keep coming back to is this constant push and pull. The whole history of logistics is basically like a giant pendulum, swinging from one extreme to the other, back and forth between these totally competing ideas.
On one side of that swing, you've got things like chaos and speed. Living off the land, being super flexible, pushing for maximum efficiency. But then the pendulum swings back to the other side. Control, endurance. We're talking massive state-run warehouses, overwhelming your enemy with sheer stuff, and building systems that can take a punch. For the last 400 years, this is the puzzle military thinkers have been trying to solve, and every era has come up with a different answer.
Okay, let's dive right in. Our first stop takes us back to a time when armies were less like organized forces and more like, well, destructive swarms of locusts.
So before we had anything like modern logistics, an army's supply chain was basically whatever it could steal from the countryside it was marching through. Brutally simple, right? But also incredibly destructive. And this all came to a head during the 30 Years' War. It exposed the system's biggest flaw. If you burn and pillage everything in your path, eventually there's nothing left. The army starves, and pretty soon the state that sent it out there collapses too.
The first guy to really get a handle on this mess was King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. He kicked off a total revolution in logistics. Instead of just chaotic looting, he brought in organized contributions from the state. He started paying his soldiers actual salaries, which helped with discipline. And, this is a big one, he standardized all his equipment. Suddenly, logistics was becoming something the state was responsible for.
And this is where you can really see that pendulum swinging hard over to the side of control. The French Marquis de Louvois took this idea and perfected it with what he called the magazine system. He built these huge warehouses, magazines, right on the frontiers and pre-stocked them with everything an army could possibly need. This was a game changer. It meant armies could fight all year round, which paved the way for the large professional state armies we associate with that whole era. But, and this is a huge but, this new system created its own kind of prison. An army was now tied to its warehouse. You could only march for about 5 days, maybe 150 kilometers, before your supply wagons had to turn around. Armies were on a logistical leash. And because of that, warfare just slowed down. It became this predictable, geometric game of besieging forts. This had massive political consequences too. Wars became limited, fought for small gains, because a big, decisive knockout blow across a continent, it was just logistically impossible.
So that sets the stage for our next chapter, where a new kind of general and some powerful new technology comes along and just shatters those chains. The pendulum is about to swing back hard.
And that general, of course, was Napoleon Bonaparte. He saw these slow, predictable armies shuffling around, and he did something totally radical. He just cut the leash. He unleashed his army to live off the land again, spreading out across the rich farms of Central Europe. The speed he gained was incredible. I mean, look at his 1805 campaign. He surrounded and captured an entire Austrian army before they even knew what hit them. He was willing to trade safety for speed, and it paid off.
But here's the twist. Napoleon's greatest strength turned into his biggest weakness. Because when he tried the same trick in Russia in 1812, it was a total disaster. Russia was vast, empty, and the Russians burned everything as they retreated. His whole system just collapsed. His massive army starved and froze to death. It was a logistical nightmare that basically ended his reign.
And right as Napoleon's model of speed at all costs was failing, a new technology pops up that solves the whole problem of distance: the railroad.
You see it first in the American Civil War, where the Union Army used trains and the telegraph to manage a war on a continental scale. But it was the Prussians under Moltke who really perfected it. They used their rail network to mobilize a huge army with terrifying speed and just crush France in 1870. That victory unified Germany and completely changed the balance of power in Europe.
So this really paints the picture of the new reality, doesn't it? The railroad broke that old 150-kilometer leash, for sure, but it just created a new one. Armies were now attached to this umbilical cord made of iron. Yeah, you could move tons of men and supplies, but only where the tracks went. The rails were their lifeline, but they were also their biggest weakness.
This total dependence on infrastructure leads us right into our next era, because now the internal combustion engine arrives and changes the whole game again. Suddenly, the most important thing isn't what your soldiers eat, it's what your machines drink.
And that brings us to the new king of the battlefield, POL. Petroleum, oil, and lubricants. In World War II, armies didn't march on their stomachs anymore. They marched on their fuel tanks. The whole German blitzkrieg strategy, it was basically a giant bet on being able to capture enemy fuel fast enough. And the Allies' final victory, you could argue it was built on their massive control over the world's oil.
A perfect example of this in action is the famous Red Ball Express. So after D-Day, the Allied armies broke out from the beaches and moved so fast they literally outran their supplies. Plus, the French rail system was totally wrecked. What do? They create this incredible, non-stop convoy of almost 6,000 trucks, driving 24/7 to get fuel to Patton's tanks. It was a logistical miracle, for sure, but it was also a brute force solution that burned a crazy amount of fuel just to deliver fuel. But hey, it worked. It kept the advance going.
So after World War II, with its massive just-in-case approach to supplies, that pendulum, it swings again. We enter the information age, the corporate age, and the new magic word is efficiency. And you can see the two competing philosophies right here. In the first Gulf War in '91, the U.S. military built a literal iron mountain of supplies in the desert. I mean, they had so much stuff they lost track of it. So after that, they looked to the business world, think Walmart, and adopted this idea of just-in-time logistics. The goal was to use data to send only what was needed, right when it was needed. No more wasteful mountains of stuff.
Well, turns out there was a big problem. A battlefield is not a Walmart warehouse. When the invasion of Iraq kicked off in 2003, those super efficient, thin supply lines got hit. There were ambushes, sandstorms, and the whole system just buckled. Suddenly you had troops waiting for water, for spare parts, for everything. Just in time became just too late. The pendulum had swung too far toward efficiency, and it created a system that was quick but dangerously brittle.
And that brings us pretty much to today. The hard lessons from Iraq, and especially what we're seeing in the war in Ukraine, are forcing another major rethink. A new revolution that's trying to stop that pendulum from swinging so wildly from one extreme to the other.
So the future isn't about picking a side. It's not Iron Mountain or just in time. The new goal is something called smart redundancy. Imagine using AI to chew through tons of data, weather, enemy positions, fuel usage, to predict what a unit needs before they even know they need it. Imagine autonomous drones zipping blood plasma to a medic in the middle of a firefight, or 3D printing a replacement part right there on the spot instead of waiting for it to be shipped. The idea is to be both efficient and resilient at the same time. So we've gone from simple plunder all the way to predictive AI. This whole 400-year story has been about trying to master the physical, messy reality of war. But as we get closer and closer to these fully automated, AI-driven supply chains, it leaves us with a really big question to chew on. In the future, who's really in charge? Is it the general drawing up the big plans, or is it the algorithm that's telling the general what's even possible in the first place?